Right, good evening and welcome to today's second meeting of the Customer and Corporate Services and Scrutiny Management Committee. Just before we get started proper, I'm going to very briefly just set out how the meeting will work. So just a reminder to all members present that these meetings are webcast and saved to YouTube for posterity, so do just keep that in mind at all times. In terms of the mechanics of the meeting, I've asked everybody who's participating to indicate they wish to speak by raising the blue hand within Zoom, which is visible to me as chair, but not people watching at home. So I'm not just selecting people at random. They have indicated they want to speak, but if they're wanting to make an additional point on the particular item that we're discussing, they can raise a physical hand to ask to make a supplementary interjection, and wherever possible I will try to bring people in. During the meeting, we're going to be joined on screen throughout by Janie Berry, who is the Director of Governance and the Monitoring Officer, and also by Dawn Steele, who's the Head of Civic and Democratic Services. We've got a Democracy Officer in the background recording the minutes for the meeting, and we also got technical officers who are supporting us and hopefully we won't hear from, but if something goes a little bit awry, you might hear a voice coming over the ether, and that'll be who that is. We do have additional participants to join us on one of the agenda items, so when we reach that point we will bring them in and I'll introduce who they are. And I'm planning to take a short adjournment at an appropriate point around the halfway mark of this meeting, just to give people a chance for a breather and to give their eyes a rest. So in terms of apologies for this evening's meeting, I've just received one set of apologies, which is from Councillor Stuart Barnes. He's going to be substituted this evening by Councillor Kilbane. Now, Councillor Kilbane and Councillor Mason have both indicated that they're going to need to leave a little bit early this evening, so they'll be with us for the duration until the point where they need to leave, and I'll just make a note when they do have to leave. On to the main items then. Agenda item 1 is declarations of interest. Do any members wish to declare an interest in respect of any item on this evening's agenda? No, not seeing anybody. So I'll move us on to agenda item 2 then, which is the minutes. You should have the minutes from the 5:30 meeting of CSMC from the 7th of September. I've got a couple of typos that I just wanted to note, and then I've got one item for discussion, or at least to propose. So just in terms of typos, at minute 27, this was the 5:30 meeting, not the 2 p.m. meeting. And just in the paragraph that's immediately following that, at the first reference to he on the third line down, if that could just change to the chair, and then it's consistent that the he who's being referred to for the rest of the paragraph is me. On page 3, on the first paragraph beneath the York Central heading, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines down, and second word in, we've got a missing word, so it should read regarding the request for the council's review of project governance arrangements. So if that could just be amended. And then on page 4, the first paragraph on page 4, the last sentence says the 5 options were, and then there are 6 options listed beneath. So if we could just update that to read 6 options. And then what I'd like to propose is that we insert, again on page 4, between the 3rd and 4th paragraph, I'd just like to insert some wording at that point, and this is wording that I've discussed with Councillor Fenton and with Dawn Steele and Janie Berry, just to reflect the meeting. So what I'm going to do is just formally propose that we amend that minute to read, members considered the options in detail and Councillor Hollier proposed option 5. This was seconded by the chair and following a unanimous vote was carried. The chair then noted the view expressed by several members of the committee that when options relating to the car park are considered in due course, this should not be undertaken in isolation. He accepted that whilst there may be revenue implications associated with not proceeding with a replacement car park, this should not in and of itself be a reason to proceed, as there are other costs associated with cars coming into the city centre that will need to be fully considered and taken into account. So as I say, I'm formally moving that we insert that item into minute 29 of the agenda. Can I have a seconder for that, please? So Councillor Fenton's indicated that he's seconding that amended wording. So if I can just then have a show of hands, unless anybody has any further amendments to make to the minutes. I'm not seeing anybody indicating. So if I can just have a show of hands from everybody that you're satisfied that those minutes will then be a reflection of the meeting. Thank you, everybody. And I think that's unanimous from all those who were present at the meeting. So I can now move us on to agenda item 3, which is public participation, but we don't have anybody registered to speak, so we can go straight on to agenda item 4. Just before I bring the officer in, I just would like to note that we have full reports for all the agenda items for this evening's meeting, and that's very much welcome. So thank you to everybody for ensuring that we do have reports for these items. And then, as I say, agenda item 4, which is the finance and performance update. So I'd like to invite Debbie Mitchell to join us. I can see she's there now, and Debbie is the Head of Corporate Finance and Commercial Procurement and is the Council's interim Section 151 officer. So Debbie, if I can just ask you to speak to your report, and then I will offer it over to members to ask any questions.
Sure. I'll just do a very brief introduction to allow as much time as possible for your questions. So the bulk of this report, as you'll recognise, is formed from the monitoring report that was discussed at Executive last week. It sets out the forecast position for the year ahead with details of the variations being forecast across various services in the Council. I've also included a couple of paragraphs on the spending review, and unfortunately it is only a couple of paragraphs because we don't know that much about it yet. So everything that I know is in this report, I'm afraid, which is not a lot. So the position itself in terms of national finances and the Council's finances is still very fluid and uncertain. And whilst recovery is going well, I think it's fair to say it's fragile given news over recent weeks and months. So there is still a risk that, car parking income, for example, could start to drop back. So all this makes forecasting the expenditure and income really quite difficult. But we've done our best to present the current situation financially as we understand it. And I'll do my best to answer any questions that you've got, although you appreciate this is a council-wide report and therefore I will know some answers, but I might not know everything. So I might need to take some of your questions away to respond to you after the meeting. And that's all I'll say as introduction.
Thanks, Debbie. That's really helpful. So yeah, just to reiterate, members, Debbie's not necessarily going to be able to answer every last detail of every question. Where there are questions that we need a answer to, we can request that. I think it's also worth us just having in mind, especially given what else is on the agenda this evening about future work programmes and what have you, there may be areas that we may want to think about as possible areas for further scrutiny work or further looking at. So over to you. I will await your blue hands raising and bring you in with any questions that you may have. Don't all be shy. Councillor Fenton, thank you.
I'll try not to be first, but hey ho. Thank you, Debbie, for a very detailed report. Just looking at paragraph 21, which refers to the additional funds that were put into the York Financial Assistance Service budget at the beginning of the pandemic, and sort of the note that the uptake hasn't been as large as might have been expected, and just to welcome the proposal that money isn't sort of repatriated into other budgets, but is kept there in anticipation of what might be sort of tougher days to come in terms of when furlough ends. I just wondered if how regularly that will be kept under review. Is it something that I suppose we're looking for an assurance that additional money won't be repatriated until such time as we do have some comfort that those pressures are being managed in other ways.
Yeah, I think the contingency allocation was a decision, as you recall, made very early on to set that aside for the YFAS scheme and in particular resident hardship. So there's no intention at this stage to remove that, but I think it's fair to say, as you'll see from the report, there are a lot of other pressures being experienced, and therefore we're going to need to balance the overall position as best we can. So at this point in time, there are no plans to move that. We are keeping a very close eye on the expenditure. As you mentioned in your question, the impact of the end of furloughing, or, albeit the Chancellor's announced a new scheme, I think it's fair to say it's not gone down particularly well, has it? So, we don't know what's going to happen, do we, in terms of which businesses are going to need to make people redundant, and therefore what the impact is going to be on our residents. It's not been as severe as I think I thought it was going to be very early on, in terms of people coming to us for additional funds, but that's not to say that's not going to change over the next 6 months. One thing you do learn, even in a pandemic, is the next 6 months is often nothing like the last 6 months. So we are keeping a very close eye on that, and David Walker and his team are monitoring carefully what is being spent in terms of resident hardship, and anticipating any demand as best we can in that area.
Thanks, Debbie. I'm just going to jump in actually, because you mentioned furlough there, and I just wondered, you've noted in paragraph 8, that there's this new scheme that is due to sort of come in. I had picked up, but I'm not sure in terms of substantiating the number. I'd got a ballpark in my head of there being around 30,000 people in the city who had made use of the furlough scheme. And I wondered whether that is a ballpark, a sort of correct figure, or if you have any different information than that. And if it is that sort of a number, can we expect a similar sort of number to qualify for the new scheme, or do we have any indication of how many people we might be expecting to be taking up that new scheme?
I don't know about the numbers in the city that have been furloughed. I'd have to go away, and I haven't got that information. You may well be right that it's 30,000, but that's not information that I have. But I can go away and have a look at that. It's difficult, isn't it, with the new scheme? I mean, I was writing this on the day that the Chancellor made the statement, so it sort of only just made the deadline. I think the day he made the statement was the same day as the deadline for reports for this meeting, so it was very much hot off the press at the time. I haven't, to be honest, I haven't looked in detail at the new scheme. I've read some of the press reports. A number of businesses are not happy with it and don't think it's that helpful. But I'd have to go away and find out more information on that. I don't have that information, I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Mason.
Thanks. I suppose just kind of looking at benchmarking us against other authorities, how well are we doing financially? Obviously, further down the line or earlier down the line, there was councils that were, looking at bankruptcy and issuing the kind of statutory notices. Where are we in kind of along that scale of comparisons to other similar authorities? And I suppose, have we been lucky that we've been able to do some of the things because we've been, relatively in a stable position when we started going into the crisis?
Yeah, I think we're doing as well as can be expected, I think would be my assessment, really. There are a lot of councils in a much worse position than us. You're right that we had good financial health at the start, which helps enormously. That's not to say we didn't have some underlying challenges, though. So you'll be aware, particularly in social care, there were already some underlying budget pressures in regards to demographics, demand, and those kind of areas, and cost of care, actually, that were starting to become pressures for us. So some of those underlying situations haven't gone away, but the way that I think we've dealt with the pandemic and with recovery has helped us. So I know, for example, in adult social care, we continued with our home first principles, which meant that, which not other councils haven't necessarily done. So I know that there are a number of councils who have put a lot of people in residential care placements and are now wondering, how to row back from that position, shall we say. So I think the fact that we kept some of our core principles and managed as best we could has held us in good stead. There were some councils who maybe don't have the level of reserves that we have. So as you know, we've got around 7 million in our general unallocated reserve. That again holds us in good stead. That would, if needed, I'd rather not use it unless if humanly possible. But there are some councils that don't even have that level of reserve, so we're really up against it. We've not had the kind of cash flow difficulties that I know some councils have had. So broadly speaking, we've done reasonably well. That's not to say we haven't had challenges, because we have. And like I say, there are those underlying budget pressures. in social care. The other area is, as a council, we're fairly reliant on car parking income, not completely, but it's a big income generator for us. So in a situation where the whole country went into lockdown and car park income was significantly reduced, that has a massive impact on us. That's mitigated to some extent by the government's income compensation scheme. So we are getting some of that income back. And as I said, recovery has gone well, which means we have had car park income back up to much higher levels.
Thanks.
Councillor Rowley.
Thank you, Chair. Debbie, thank you for an excellent, thorough report. So thorough that my question may well be answered within the report, but I've not noticed it. Coming back to the subject of furlough. So two questions really. Did we as a council, did we put any of our staff on furlough? Secondly, how many of them are not furloughed now? And thirdly, have you factored in the impact of the new scheme in the figures that you've got?
The council didn't furlough any of its own staff because those staff that perhaps their work wasn't required during the pandemic were all redeployed to support the hubs and the response in general to the pandemic. I haven't looked yet at the new scheme in terms of whether that is something that we could consider, but as most council services are back to not exactly business as usual, but broadly business as usual, I'm not aware of any staff in the council that are not actually working either on their business as usual or on the recovery or response to the pandemic. But again, that's another one that I can take away to ask corporate directors if it's an option.
Councillor Rowley.
And Debbie, you answered to that first question. Can I say that's commendable as a local authority that we didn't actually furlough anybody? I find that amazing, but I find it to the credit of the council that we didn't, because I know that there are some councils that did. So well done.
Yeah, I think I would just add to that I think CYT Limited, who is the council-owned company that offers temporary staff, I think did furlough some staff. So whilst it wasn't direct council employees, some of the agency staff that the council used may have been furloughed. So just.
But that was no cost to us, though.
No. I just didn't want to give you the impression that nobody had been furloughed, because
okay,
some have. Yeah.
Thanks, Debbie. Councillor Pearson.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Debbie, for the report. We've already touched on it this evening, but I just wondered if you knew if any work has been taken to talk to businesses within the city about the new scheme, the job support scheme, and whether they think it's going to be enough, because they'll obviously have a lot of concerns about how they get through the winter and how they, until a vaccine, I guess, next year. I just wondered what work you knew had been done. I appreciate you might not be the best person to answer this question.
Yeah, I would have to go away and find out. I know that we are in regular discussion with a whole range of businesses through Make It York and the economic development team. So I'm sure that they have got the answers to some of those questions. So I can take that one away. We have, I think I've mentioned it in the report around. Obviously, it's not just the council that's having that COVID has had a financial impact on. A lot of our partner organisations, our health colleagues, a whole range of organisations. In fact, you'd be struggling to think, other than a supermarket, perhaps, of an organisation that hasn't been impacted by the pandemic. So we have had lots of discussions with things like the Museums Trust, Make It York, Explore, all those kind of organisations, and the CCG that you would expect us to be discussing with. So we have been in those discussions.
Thanks, Debbie.
Councillor Kilbane.
Oh, thanks, Chair, and thanks for the report, Debbie. Can I just check my understanding? We are, because of COVID, direct COVID costs, we're about 7 million short, and we're expecting 4 million off the government, which will leave us 3 million short overall as it stands now. Is that, if I got that right?
Yeah, but that's without any impact on council tax or business rate. So that's just direct expenditure on dealing with the pandemic and a sort of a direct loss of income. What that doesn't include is what is going to happen to council tax. So I think I've said this at this meeting before, but if you remember that the government has offered a whole range of reliefs for business rates, and they've paid 66 million of our business rates in this financial year. It's unlikely they're going to pay that next year. So the real impact, I think, on business rates and council tax will come to us next financial year.
Councillor Kilbane.
So I guess it's supplementary to that is we obviously we don't know what's going to happen in terms of the current wave of COVID spreading. But if we're looking at estimates of unemployment anywhere between sort of 10% and 30% in York, what kind let's take the optimistic 10%. What kind of impact will that have on our finances?
Well, yeah, 10 to 20% would, in terms of council tax and business rates, you would be talking around 15 million. It would depend on, so there's a number of calculations that you could do, I guess. So some of the, I think it was the Office for National Statistics said something around 11% of businesses might struggle or not survive in their current form. But obviously not all businesses pay business rates. So you would think, well, you know, of those businesses, they will be replaced by some other businesses. So despite the pandemic, I think there are still new businesses coming through. So it's a real difficult calculation to work out, because what we don't know is which businesses will survive and which ones won't. Now that'll depend, I guess. You know, there'll be more people on this call that are business people than I am, so you'll probably be able to answer this question better. But I guess some businesses can adapt and change more easily than others. So those businesses that are currently tied to premises and therefore pay business rates are probably at a higher risk than those type of businesses that don't have premises, and they can perhaps be a bit more agile and change their business model more quickly. And they might be the ones that do better through the pandemic. So it's a real difficult calculation to make, but we are trying to work out, you know, some kind of best and worst case scenarios, if you like. So yeah, you're right. We could be at, you know, 15% unemployment if, you know, if you say that we collect around, well, say 100 million each, actually, council tax and business rates, for argument's sake, you can see that it wouldn't take much of a drop. Now with business rates, the mechanism is slightly different because there is a government safety net which is in place. So if you, I should know this number, but I can't remember off the top of my head. There's a limit below which, if your business rates drop that significantly, there's a safety net that kicks in, and the government will make up the difference. So not make up all the difference, but will stop you falling below safety net. And that was designed so that if, for example, a district council had a power station in it which paid a massive amount of business rates and that closed, that would have a significant impact in that area. So there are different mechanisms that the government uses to smooth that out. They've also said that business rates and council tax are paid into what's called a collection fund. It's slightly separate to the general fund. You can have a deficit on the collection fund, but you've got to recover it in the next financial year. They've already said that we can spread a deficit over a longer time period. So if there was a worst case scenario that occurred in the next financial year, and say you dropped income of 20% for business rates and council tax, you wouldn't necessarily have to find compensatory savings for that all in the first year. You would have a 3-year timescale over which you could look and plan some savings to have a more measured approach rather than an initial reaction.
Councillor Rowley, I think you've got a supplementary to that.
I have, Chair. Thank you. Debbie, you kind of stole my thunder there, because one of my questions was going to be around that. So clearly there is the facility for us to defer that or to stretch that over a 3-year period if necessary. Are there any other areas where we can get a deferment from the government in terms of any statutory payments that we need to make?
Not as yet, no. Although we don't know much about the spending review, such as what the spending envelope is, when they're going to announce it, all those kind of quite important things. There are still discussions, I think, going on at a national level around other support for councils, for local government. I think there has been a recognition of the local government response. So, I mean, it might not happen, but there is still this talk about, in the same way that they have with the income compensation scheme, whether the government will share any losses of business rates and council tax with us. So at the moment, that would be all our loss, in the same way that the sales fees and charges was all our loss. But because they've brought in the income compensation scheme, where they don't cover all the loss, but they cover quite a lot of it, then there is still an option that they might bring in a scheme like that as part of the spending review. So we'll have to wait and see.
Councillor Hollier.
Thanks, Chair. On a sort of slightly non-COVID issue for a change. I know there's been a few more sort of further updates to businesses, just on the impact to the sort of end of the Brexit transition period. I'm just wondering whether there are any sorts of similar updates or sort of work that's ongoing to sort of keep local authorities updated as well in terms of risks and issues.
Not that I've seen, but what we're doing in terms of Brexit is refreshing the work that we did pre-pandemic. So what we were doing pre-pandemic was making sure that we kept an up-to-date list of our key suppliers, either by value or by importance of the service that they were delivering for us, and we were regularly getting details from them of their contingency plans in relation to Brexit. So we have restarted that work, and we're in the process now of liaising with all our key suppliers to assure ourselves that they've got the necessary contingency plans in place so that supply is uninterrupted. But I haven't seen anything specific to local government, but I can check that.
Thanks, Debbie. I've just got a couple of questions for you. One, I think Councillor Kilbane was sort of going in the direction, but it more specifically, I suppose, around the potential need of dipping into reserves and you know what happens if we reach that point. And I think paragraph 19 just says something that should it be the case that we need to draw down from the general reserve, growth will be included in the 2021 budget to ensure that the reserves are maintained at an appropriate level. And that obviously, you know, I totally accept and support that as a approach, but over what time frame would you anticipate? Let's say that we have to we have to dip into the tune of 2 million, say. Would you expect that 2 million to then be reinstated in the next financial year, or over 5 years or 10 years? What's the sort of length of the impact that dipping into reserves might take?
Yeah, we wouldn't have to necessarily do it all in the first year, although obviously my preference would be to do it all in the first year, but recognition of the other pressures and challenges that the council's facing, we would look at what was sensible and what was achievable without too much impact on services to residents. So yeah, reserves are difficult, aren't they? Because you know, it's rainy day money essentially, and this is a rainy day, but the more uncertainty there is and the more risk there is, the more need there is to have sufficient reserves should something unexpected happen. So I wouldn't necessarily expect us to replace it all in the next financial year, but I would want to see a planned approach over, say, a 3-year period. 5 years at a stretch, I would suggest, but normally we tend to do the medium-term financial plan over a 3-year period. We do capital over 5. So I would look over that 3-year period to ensure that we had sufficient reserves in place, both during that period and certainly by the end of that 3-year period, because that would give you the time, I think, to plan what you wanted to do and how you could deliver the savings or reduce the growth needs or reduce your expenditure in order to ensure that you had a sufficient reserve.
Councillor Kilbane, is that supplementary to that?
So well, essentially, that in combination with any sort of economic hit that we get through the winter now, you know, we could be looking at years and years of cuts.
In a worst case scenario, yeah, you know, the worst case scenario, you could be back to the position we were in, you know, in austerity days. But I think that we're a much leaner organisation now than we might have been 10 years ago, and we would obviously be looking at efficiencies, different ways of doing things, you know, involving the community. But there would be no getting around the fact that we would be able to do less as an authority because we would have less money. So I wouldn't want to give you the impression that we can still carry on doing absolutely everything we can do if we had significantly less money, because clearly that wouldn't be realistic. So there would have to be some reductions in expenditure. Yeah.
Thanks, Debbie. Councillor Fenton.
Just thinking of a point that the Director of Public Health made at the meeting this afternoon around the public health team sort of doing what they can to complement the work that Public Health England are doing. And I know that over the past few weeks and months have been sort of various calls for increased government support for local authorities. Is there any indication from what you've seen and heard whether we can expect further announcements from government around either sort of general or more targeted support for local authorities for things such as the work of the public health team, or is it a case of we just wait to see what announcements come and hope for the best?
Sadly, it's the latter. We're just going to have to wait and see what the announcements are. I haven't heard anything other than the issue being discussed around potentially helping councils with their council tax and business rate losses, although that's not guaranteed. We don't have any information ordinarily at this point in time. We might know what the overall spending envelope would be. We might know what the overall value of, say, the public health grant would be, and we could try and work out what our share of that might be. We don't even know if there's going to be an increase in the public health grant at this stage. It's all very tight-lipped in that respect.
Thank you. I just want to ask you a couple of questions. And in a way, I'm kind of going back to questions that I've asked previously, and I appreciate that I might be asking you to sort of answer on behalf of the corporate directors of the two social care elements. But the overspends that we're seeing in both adult and in children's are significant and were significant pre-coronavirus. And in fact, we had to bail out both those areas to, I think, a fairly significant degree at the end of the last financial year. If from memory, it was nearly £1 million to children's and I think about £2 million to adult. And even with that, we're now looking at about 8 million overspend overall in those two areas. And from reading through the detail of the report, all of the areas where the overspend is occurring are things like looked after children, things like adult mental health. These are areas that I would suggest are only going to come under more pressure with the impact of coronavirus. And I fully appreciate that, this is a countrywide phenomena. It's not necessarily something that's limited to York, but are there systemic issues within what we're doing in the city? And is there, what are the conversations that are going on? Because we're not going to be in a position to bail out those two areas to the tune of £3 or £4 million at the end of this financial year. And if we have another overspend of a similar amount next year, irrespective of anything else that's going on with the wider economy, we're going to be in some quite serious trouble, aren't we?
Well, those two service areas in particular are acutely aware of the financial pressures, as you would expect, and the corporate directors are working really hard on coming up with mitigation, identifying efficiencies, and making the system as sort of as efficient and effective as possible. So there are some some changes in terms of preventative work that I think can make a really big difference. So if you can support somebody at the right time so that they don't need to go into residential care, I think the information that we get from people regularly is that people don't want to go into residential care. It's not something that anybody wants to happen. So the more that we can put into that preventative work, the less we will have to spend on residential care, which is something that most people don't want. I think the difficulty is it takes time. So I can't, there's a phrase about turning the QE2 or something, isn't there? But it's that kind of really long time. Once you've started to have an impact, you won't see it for a number of years, particularly in relation to older people, because obviously once somebody is placed in a residential care placement, then they tend to stay there. There's not many people that come out of residential care back into living in the community. So the work to prevent people having to go into residential care and therefore being able to stay in their community is work that is ongoing now, and we are starting to see a reduction in the number of people admitted to residential care and nursing care. So that means that we're capping that pressure. The difficulty that all councils are experiencing is the change in demographics and the increasing cost of care. So if you can prevent people coming into care, that's great, but that's as much cost avoidance as it is savings. So the increase in population, we're seeing an increase in complex needs as well, and an increase, like I say, in the cost of that care. So all those things together, you know, are adding to the pressures. I think that I'm sure if Amanda and Sharon were here, they'd be able to tell you lots of things that they're doing that are starting to have an impact. But that preventative work, I think, is one of the main things. So the social prescribing, the local area teams, the involving communities, so that you know, combating social isolation and all those different things all work together. But it is slow going in that respect, because you know, you're talking about people's lives, aren't you? And the way that people change how they live their lives doesn't happen overnight. So we're working on the second monitoring report now, actually, and also looking at the mitigation strategies that each of those directorates are putting in place to try and manage their overall position. So we'll have an update on that at the November executive, and I would hope to see a much improved position in those areas. I've said it now, haven't I? That's famous last words now, isn't it? I've set myself right up for that one. So.
Councillor Kilbane, I'll bring you in a second, but I mean, I appreciate what you're saying, and I appreciate that these are things that take a long time to turn around, and particularly on things like early help. You know, if you're looking at an early intervention for a 2-year-old that prevents them going into care in, you know, as a 16-year-old, you know, then it obviously takes a very long time for that to be fed through. But if we've got directorates that are overspending year on year, and certainly the 3 years since I've been a councillor, each of those directorates has overspent by, you know, that sort of order of overspend. It doesn't suggest that that's going to be changed next year or the year after. So I'm wondering, just from a purely financial point of view, because I appreciate you can't speak to the specifics of the directorate, but you know, when you're looking at the council's budget going forward, and I presume you do some long range forecasting on things, I mean, when are you expecting them to break even? Are we expecting that we'll be having overspends of 3 and 4 million next year? And even if it's half that, that's still a significant problem, I suppose.
Yeah, well, as part of the longer term financial strategy, we are looking at what growth we might need to put into those areas in order to allow them to stay within budget. I think the difficulty is that it obviously it changes depending, you know, as you probably know, you can get you know, a younger person with very complex needs that can be significantly expensive, and you're talking the hundreds of thousands for one person, and so obviously you can't necessarily predict that. So I'm certainly hoping that certainly over the next year to 18 months we start to see a significant shift in the direction of travel, so that we can start to plan a bit more longer term to get them back within budget. But it's difficult to put a timescale on that. But certainly when I'm looking at the medium-term financial strategy, we are looking at what growth we might need to put in for those services that is realistic and that is affordable. But the more growth we put in, the more savings we have to deliver as well. So it's a real balancing act between what realistically can we deliver with the budget that we've got available, and how can we best meet the needs of our residents. What's the best way to get them the right outcomes? So it's not necessarily about inputs, it's about outcomes as well, to try and kind of, you know, different ways to get people to the place that they need to be.
Thanks, Debbie. Councillor Kilbane, did you have a supplementary?
Just very briefly, I mean, you have my sympathy, Debbie, because you're essentially trying to square a circle, aren't you? You know, this is a national problem, and until we get a new funding settlement, we're always just going to be robbing Peter to pay Paul in order to try and cover these costs. Anyway, more of a comment, really. Don't expect you to respond to that.
Thanks, Councillor Kilbane. I'm just looking for blue hands. You're all very welcome to ask questions. I do have a couple more that I will plough on with in anticipation of anybody wanting to chuck in anything else. I just wanted to take you to paragraph 23 in waste collection services. And again, I appreciate you may or may not be able to give us a direct answer on this, but obviously I appreciate the way that a lot of that work was done, it changed, and you know, you're sort of reporting some cost pressures and what have you in there. Historically, we had quite significant problems with sickness in the waste services, and I think the resulting cost from whether it's agency or bringing in extra people or missed bins and what have you. But there's no mention of anything to do with the sickness absence within that directorate, and I just wondered whether or not that had been any sort of factor as well as everything else that is mentioned.
I think that I haven't got the staff absence numbers to hand, I'm afraid, although they are regularly distributed around the council management team. So I can speak to Neil about what it's looking like in that area. Since we introduced Medigal, the council's absence monitoring system, we've got much better information around absence and a much clearer idea of the issues in that area. So I think there were still some ongoing sickness absence, but obviously there were a lot of people absent due to quarantining and other things during the early part of this financial year. So it was difficult, I think, to distinguish between who was off sick because of one reason and who was off sick because they were isolating due to COVID. I think that information is available, but I don't have it. So it's not that it's no longer an issue, sickness absence. It clearly is something the council needs to keep a very close eye on. I think we discussed this briefly at Audit and Governance Committee actually around the it's no longer a kind of a governance or a process or a system issue. It's more of an operational managerial issue now. So all the tools are in place for managers to be able to effectively manage sickness absence, which was the issue that had been picked up by Audit and Governance a couple of years ago. And I think this committee actually in a previous grouping of this committee spent quite a lot of time looking at absence management as well, pre this group, I think. So a lot of work has been done on it, and it is more of an operational matter. But I can get some more information on absence for you.
Thanks. Yeah, the day one absence stuff we were certainly supposed to be monitoring, but then obviously the work plan went out the window slightly. But we may come to that in a future agenda item. I suppose then just the one other thing that I wanted to just get completely straight in my head, and so forgive me if this is just doing it in a very overly simplistic way. It's some of a bit of what Councillor Kilbane was asking earlier on, but from going through the report and looking at the numbers as I'm seeing them, we have lost about 18 million in income. We've received about 15 million in subsidy and what have you. So we've got the net loss of around 3 million. We've got overspends within what we were already doing of around about sort of 8 million, and that's been mitigated by about 4 million. So that gives us a total combined an overspend of 4 million plus a loss of 3 million. That takes us to about 7 million sort of out of pocket, as it were, and our reserves are around about the same amount. 7 is, I think, give or take a couple of 100,000. So how does that 7 million get made up so that we don't end up dipping into the reserves? And forgive me if we can just do it as simplistically as possible. So I know when you're sort of talking about growth in this area and all the rest of it, but just in very, very simplistic terms, if we're about 7 million out of pocket, how do we not have to dip into the reserves at the end of the year?
Through mitigation, through looking at other non-essential expenditure. So you may be aware I've talked before about looking at vacancy management in terms of council staffing. So not recruiting to posts unless they're absolutely essential or they're income generating. Other efficiencies, there will be efficiencies from staff not working in West offices, things like printing and other things. They're quite small, I think, in fact, because we don't spend a lot on those kind of areas anyway. But the main area is 7
million would buy you a lot of printing, wouldn't it?
Yeah, no, it's not. That's not going to be enough. The main area is looking in those directorates, particularly around what they can do differently, what they can stop doing, and what we can get somebody else to do if possible. So go on, sorry
to interrupt you, but I mean, just in very simplistic terms then, are we essentially saying that we either are going to have to not deliver some services, whether that be through cutting the service or through not filling a post, to deliver a service, or we're going to have to dip into reserves. Is that essentially where we are at the moment?
Not necessarily. There will be some efficiencies that can be driven out of some of these service areas, and there will be things that we can do that don't actually. It's back to what I was saying earlier about meeting the outcomes, the needs of residents. Is not always about providing services. So it's not about what we're putting in, it's about meeting the need and getting the right outcomes for residents. And there are a number of different ways you can do that. There are some things, obviously, nobody else is going to go and collect your bin for you, and we're not going to expect everybody to take their bin somewhere. So there are some things that will carry on, but there's a whole range of other services, in particular support services, back office functions, the customer service, the customer centre, continuing with that channel shift. So nobody's going into West offices, even though it's open. Nobody's going in, nobody's making appointments. An increasing number of people doing things digitally. Needs a slightly different skill set, but you need fewer people potentially to do some of that work. So it's not all about cutting services or using reserves. There will be some efficiencies, but under no illusion that we need to sort of tighten our belts and manage more efficiently and more effectively where possible. There'll be some streamlining. There'll be a whole range of things we can do. We're looking at capital charges to make sure that we're not overstating anything like capital charges. And I would say that I think this forecast will come down. What tends to, again, famous last words, I'm setting myself up for so much here, but what tends to happen as you go through the year is at the first monitor, everybody tells you about all their overspends because people want to tell you about their problems, and nobody mentions their underspends because everybody's confident they're going to deliver what they plan to do in that year. As you go through the year, you do start to drive out some of those underspends. So managers, when you're asking them in June, July, will say, no, I'm definitely going to spend that. By the time you get to January, it's pretty clear whether they're going to spend it or not. So it will improve. But I don't want to underestimate the scale of the challenge here for directors and managers in the council. And I don't want to set any hairs running or set any false expectations, but there definitely needs to be some work done on the mitigation strategies to identify where we can reduce expenditure. So we're already looking at agency staff, temporary staff, overtime, additional hours, all those range of things that you would expect us to look at. And again, we're not unique in that. Most other councils are doing the same. We'll be looking at any non-essential spend, so any discretionary training spend, a whole range of things that the council spends that we'll be looking at to ensure that it's essential expenditure only until we can get back on track. Like I say, the reserves are there for exactly this reason, but once you've used them, they're gone. So it's not, I don't want anybody to see that use of reserves as an easy solution or as a solution to the problem of trying to get the budget back into balance and managing our expenditure within the approved budget.
Thanks, Debbie. That's helpful, and I'm not meaning this to sort of undermine what you've just said, but I think this is sort of getting to the heart of the problem and my unease in a way at some of what you're saying, because I do appreciate, and I'm not suggesting for a second that we just use all the reserves and pay it all off this year and worry about next year, but talking about mitigating and efficiencies and what have you sort of suggests that there's been profligacy up till this point. And I just don't believe that that's the case. We know that we've lost £100 million out of York's government funding and what have you in the last 10 years. We have already, I think, stripped everything right to the bone in terms of efficiency and what have you. And so I'm just wondering at what point we just say quite straightforwardly, we can't deliver these services anymore unless something else changes. Because I think that's probably is sort of what you're saying, but maybe you're not. Well, maybe it's for us to say it. But as I say, I just worry that if we always talk in efficiency and mitigation and whatever, it rather implies that there's anything left to cut.
What I would say is you're right. I think we're already a pretty lean organisation in that respect. We've been through a number of transformation programmes, efficiency programmes. But sometimes things creep back in. So I would say that I can't hand on heart say that every single service in the council is running as efficiently as it could be. So that's a piece of work for us to do. You're right in one respect, in that if we're not going to get any more money from government, and clearly the approach is that the government needs to fund the impact of COVID properly, and were they to do that, we would still have the underlying budget pressure in social care that we've talked about. But that would be something we could manage and we could plan for. The COVID expenditure is obviously totally unexpected and totally unknown, and we don't know what is to come either. It's not over, is it, by any stretch of the imagination? So that uncertainty, I would say uncertainty to such a degree that the Chancellor's cancelled the national budget. Now, that's not a luxury that's afforded to us, is it? So we're not able to just cancel our budget. We have to carry on, and so it does make planning really difficult. The situation could improve. I think we've got enough of a grip on what is happening to enable us to do that monitoring effectively. There isn't a lot of slack to go at, you're right, but there are areas where you can look at things differently. It's about managing expectations. So it's about how we work as a city, as a community, as residents, as an organisation, to manage within the resources that we have as a city to get the best outcomes for residents. So there are lots of things that you could do, and there are lots, I hesitate to say it, but I'll say it. So printing agendas, for example. We print agendas for meetings. It's not massive, but it's still money. And so from my point of view, as a finance person, I would look at that and say, well, is that absolutely essential? And I would suggest it's not. As politicians, you might have a different view. So it's not about making it more difficult for how people work, but that's just one small example of where you could look to say, can we do this differently? Can we do this more efficiently, more carbon friendly? There's a whole range. And like I say, it's a bit of a silly example, but I use it because it's one that everybody will understand, and it's one that's pertinent to you as a group. You'll have your own views about it, obviously, but there are different ways that you could achieve the same objectives.
Thanks, Debbie. I've got Councillor Kilbane and Councillor Pearson just waiting to ask questions, and then I think I shall wrap this item up. So, Councillor Kilbane.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, personally, I find having a printed agenda in front of me very useful. But of course, us politicians are printing them at home these days. So you've passed the costs on to us, but I don't think there's going to be much sympathy from the public around that, which is fine. But I think, I appreciate the position that you're in, Debbie, but I think we've really got to call a cut. So if we're not going to recruit into posts that are deemed to be non-essential, what that means is that the people of the city get a worse service. So if you've got a job, you've got a team of 3 and somebody leaves and you don't recruit into that team, then at best, the people of York get 2/3 of the service that they used to get. Now, we all know that's the situation, and we all know that most of that situation is actually beyond our control. So I just think we need to be straight with people and tell them that we might still be delivering the services, but they're actually the worse than they used to be, because we just haven't got the resources to deliver them that we used to. And just one other question, I mean, that's more of a statement really, isn't it? So one other question, if we are moving to digital, and I'm all in favour of using West offices less. I've always said I think it'd make a great swimming pool. But if we are moving to digital, we are going to disenfranchise a lot of people in the city who don't do digital. So really, we need to make sure that doesn't happen.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So digital inclusion, along with financial inclusion, is obviously a key strand of that work. So, it's fair to say none of this will be done without looking at the equalities impact assessments and all the things that you would expect us to be doing. And you're right, I don't disagree. A cut is a cut, no matter how you say it. I think the difficulty that I would say at this point in time is the uncertainty. So the reason I'm probably being slightly cagey in my answers is, I don't know what's going to happen in terms of the spending review. So the spending review could come along and it could be great, and all this could go away. I doubt it, but it could. And so ordinarily, at this point in the year, I would have a much better idea of what our spending envelope was, and I would be able to give better advice in terms of planning financially. The difficulty, I mean, it's like trying to work out your household budget when you don't know how much your salary is. I mean, it's impossible, isn't it? And that's the kind of situation that we're in. So I take your point about that honesty and transparency and saying it how it is. I think my sort of slight reluctance on that is I don't know how it is just yet, because it is still so fluid and uncertain. So hopefully as the year progresses, we'll get a lot more certainty on that, and we'll be able to do that, exactly what you're saying. And yeah, and I'll like I say, the digital inclusion is another strand of that work.
Thanks, Debbie. I think I'm slightly disappointed you didn't pick up on Councillor Cobain's suggestion of turning West offices into a swimming pool. I can see the press headline tomorrow, and it's be a nice little outcome from the meeting, wouldn't it?
I think I've set myself up for enough falls in this meeting, haven't I? So I won't add that one to the list. Yeah.
Right, I've just got one last question from Councillor Pearson, and then I'm going to move us to a 5-minute adjournment. So, Councillor Pearson.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks again, Debbie. It's just it's interesting to know, we talked a lot about efficiencies and stuff like that, but are we expecting any more support from central government? I think the council's lobbied fairly successfully for extra funding, not only to support council services but also for sectors within the city. Are there any areas where you think we ought to be lobbying central government more for extra funding to make sure that services can be sustained and provided?
Not that I can think of. As you say, we've done some lobbying in terms of some of the areas of our partners, such as leisure, that are not covered from the income compensation scheme. So we've lobbied on that point, and I think, as we've said all through this is not a York problem as such. It's not a York issue. It's a national issue, and there are a number of councils that are in a significantly worse position than us. So I think that the government at some point will have to do something, unless they want to see a complete issue across all of local government. I think that it will depend on the strength of the economic recovery, and that is good for, York's always had a very healthy economy, hasn't it? A healthy local economy. Other cities perhaps not as fortunate. So I think a lot of it will also depend on the strength of the economic recovery and how well that does nationally, and not just in York. So no, to answer your question, I can't think of anything else that we would be asking government for that we haven't already asked for.
Thanks, Debbie. Well, thank you very much for your report and update. I think there's obviously a ton of stuff to get our teeth into and get our heads around, but that is really helpful in your answers this evening. What I'm going to do is move us now to a quick adjournment. I'm going to suggest I make it just after 6:30, so I'm going to suggest that we are back in the room just before 7:20 with a view to going back live again at 7:20. So if you can all just switch off your video feeds and follow the instructions, and I'll see you in 5 minutes. Right, welcome back everyone to this evening's meeting of Customer Corporate Services and Scrutiny Management Committee. I just want to note that Councillors Kilbane and Councillor Mason have both now left the meeting, but we do still remain quorate, so we shall continue with business, and I will move us straight on to agenda item 5, which is the public scrutiny arrangements and decision making. Now, actually, the way that I'm going to do this part of the meeting is I'm just going to give you a little bit of background and an update to where we are with things, and then invite Councillor Fenton, Dawn Steele and Janie Berry to add anything that I may have missed, and then just take questions from the rest of the committee members if there's anything that we haven't been clear about. But you might recall that when we first started doing public scrutiny again in a remote way back in July, we said that we would operate with just CSMC as the only committee holding public meetings until there was an opportunity to review things in early October. Now, actually, we've done quite a lot of work over the last few weeks, thinking about how the committee system is working and what we can and can't do. I think it's probably just worth me at this point just referring back to the proposal that we made at the last meeting, which was that myself and Councillor Fenton would, with the committee's blessing, go and seek a meeting with Councillor Aspden, just to stress the frustration that we had with the lack of support for scrutiny, both in terms of reports and in terms of officer time. And so we did have that meeting within a couple of weeks of the last CSMC meeting. I think it was a reasonably constructive meeting. We all acknowledged, everybody present acknowledged that resources are restricted at the moment, and that makes delivering a full suite of scrutiny as we previously have had difficult. Councillor Aston agreed to restate his commitment to public scrutiny and to stress to corporate directors and other senior officers that where scrutiny is asking for their support, whether that be through reports or otherwise, that that support does need to be forthcoming. But we all acknowledge that even if we had resources at the moment to be able to employ additional scrutiny officers, it would take time to recruit and time to train, and so we need to come up with a plan of action that reflects the position that we're currently find ourselves in, and then we can look at where we are and where we want to be going forward. So what we've done is we've tried to look at how we can deliver the most amount of scrutiny in the most efficient and robust way for the remainder of the municipal year. So we're basically proposing some changes to the way that scrutiny operates that will come in from November and will remain in place throughout the municipal year up until May. I'm quite keen that what we also start is a conversation about how we would like scrutiny to look in the longer term, and start thinking about whether there are any changes that we want to make, anything that comes out of this next few months that is an improvement on how we've done scrutiny previously. And then what I'd like to do is look at what resources we need to be able to support that function, rather than the opposite way around of sort of saying, here are the resources we've got and here's what we can deliver. So you've hopefully all had an opportunity to read through the report itself. I just want to kind of highlight a couple of key points, and then I'll invite Councillor Fenton just to add anything else. The first thing I just want to make sure that all committee members have imprinted in their memory is the 4 kind of key points of scrutiny, and this was suggestions that came from the Centre for Public Scrutiny, and that was adopted as part of the statutory scrutiny guidance in 2019, and that's that our job is to provide constructive critical friend challenge, to amplify the voices and concerns of the public, to be led by independent people who take responsibility for their role, and to drive improvements in public services. So that's what we should have at the forefront of our mind all the time when we're undertaking scrutiny work. What we're proposing to do for York in a practical sense is that this committee, as the statutory scrutiny committee, will continue to meet monthly, but we will just meet once per month. So we'll have the 5:30 meeting, but we won't be doing the afternoon meetings going forward. We will then have every one of the scrutiny committees that we had pre-coronavirus operating on a quarterly basis. So they'll hold a quarterly public meeting, and that quarterly meeting will be where the kind of overview and the challenge comes. So I'm envisaging that we'll have agendas that will probably reflect some of the discussion we've had already in this meeting with the performance of finance monitoring reports as the sort of beginning point, but being able to go into more depth with both the executive member and the corporate directors potentially there at those meetings. And then from those quarterly public meetings, I'm anticipating that the committees will look for areas that they want to do further work, will look for things that they're interested in looking at in some more depth, and will then have a quarterly forum meetings. Forum meetings will be held in private, but will be with expected attendance from corporate directors, executive members, and anybody else that committee sees as being appropriate to attend, really. And the idea of those meetings is that they're an opportunity to have perhaps a more open discussion around the thinking behind future work, thinking about things that are not yet on the forward plan that might be coming down the line in 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, some of the background stuff. And from those forum meetings, what I'm anticipating is that the committee members will make recommendations to CSMC for the scrutiny management of areas that they would like to do some additional work on that would be public. And so the other thing sitting alongside the quarterly public scrutiny meetings and the quarterly forum meetings that we're having is that we're also then proposing to have 2 public slots every month that will be for what we're calling commissioned scrutiny. Now, one of those 2 will have to be kept available for call-in, and we've timetabled it so that there's enough of a gap after executive for one of the meetings to be available for a call-in should it be needed. And as members will know, we've struggled a little bit over the last 2 or 3 months to find slots when call-ins have happened. So that should give a little bit more predictability around when those meetings might take place. But where a call-in hasn't come in, we'll be trying to use those slots for a commissioned scrutiny, and then the second slot will be a guaranteed commissioned scrutiny. Now, commissioned scrutiny, the way that I'm envisaging that working is that we will be asking one of the other committees, or possibly our own committee, to take forward a specific and discrete piece of work that may relate to something that's on the forward plan. So, for example, it might be a piece of pre-decision scrutiny similar to the work that we did looking at the Castle Gateway at last month's meeting, where committee members are asked to consider a report, make any comment or suggestions, and make a recommendation to executive about something which is already on their forward plan. Or it might be about identifying an area of policy where something isn't working properly, or we don't have a clear policy at the moment, where committee members could be able to develop something that would be, again, like I say, a discrete piece of work, but perhaps making a proposal for a policy change or a policy recommendation. Now, as we are the committee that has scrutiny management as part of our function, we would be looking to fill those commissioned slots. And again, the way that I envisage that working is that it wouldn't be us acting in isolation. It will be in conjunction with the portfolio holder, with the corporate director, with the chairs of the appropriate scrutiny committees. And basically what we're trying to do is manage scrutiny a little bit better so that we are acknowledging the limited resources that we have and trying to get the most impact that we can possibly have from a scrutiny perspective with the resources that we have available to us. So I think that's kind of a summary of where we are at the moment. And you've got annexed to your reports the dates of all of those meetings as we're seeing them operating going forward. The next agenda item is going to be around some of the specifics of the work plan. So what I propose that we do is just keep anything in terms of specific topics or areas for the next agenda item. But as a broad principle, I think that's how we're seeing scrutiny moving for the next few months. And like I say, I'd like us to have in mind, if there are things around that approach that seem to be a more constructive way of doing scrutiny in York, that we might begin a process more formally of reviewing how scrutiny works as a whole, to potentially take on some of those changes as more permanent changes, though obviously that would require full council's consent, and there's a whole process around that. So Councillor Fenton, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to what I've said, or if I've missed anything out or got something completely wrong.
No, I think you've covered the kind of main mechanics, Chair. I think I think what this approach will hopefully deliver is a return to some public scrutiny for the scrutiny committees that haven't been meeting in public, but also retaining some of the benefits that have been realised in the past few months, when through necessity the meetings of those scrutiny committees have been informal and haven't been webcast. But I think for certainly some of the discussions I've been involved in, they've been really productive meetings where there's active engagement with with officers and with executive members, and I think it has again, it's given an insight into how how scrutiny can work in terms of that sort of forum for discussion and policy development. And I think those commissioned slots, there may be some occasions, but we don't use them because the timing of the formal scrutiny may fall at the right time in order for for a topic to be picked up in a timely manner by a particular scrutiny committee. But it gives us that flexibility, and obviously having the call-in slots, which has always been the case previously, where you'd have the call-in slot on the assumption that there's always a possibility it would be needed. I think just on the kind of scrutiny resource issue, I think what it highlights to my mind is that given the situation we're in, it's more important than ever that scrutiny is member-led. It's meant to be member-led, but that doesn't happen by accident. It requires members of the scrutiny committee to put the time and the thinking into pieces of work, and not simply expect officers to do all of your thinking for you. But that's I suppose a challenge for all of us, and particularly for the chairs of the scrutiny committees, to create that environment in which members can get involved and can make a contribution. But that's a few observations, but I think it's in all of our interest to make these arrangements work.
Thanks, Councillor Fenton. And just to really emphasise that point, I wholly agree around the member-led part. And I think what one of the things that has really driven the discussions has been around trying to make the input that scrutiny has as meaningful as possible. Because if members feel that they're making a difference, having an influence, having an input, then that hopefully creates a virtuous circle of the more that we feel that we're doing constructive work, the more that we're wanting to do more and more constructive work. So that's certainly been what's underpinned a lot of the discussions. Dawn, if I could just bring you in with your sort of statutory scrutiny officer hat on. I don't know if there's anything that you wanted to add to what we've said.
I don't think there is actually, Chair. I think both you and the Vice Chair have summarised where we're at quite clearly and effectively. I think it's just a matter of seeking members' opinion. If there are any questions that Janie or I can answer in terms of any specific angles that members may come from, then we're here to do so. Sorry, I'm still struggling with this point.
No worries. Thanks, Dawn. And Janie, just before I go to the other members of the committee for questions, I don't know if there's anything that you wanted to add. The one other thing I just wanted you to, if you could, because the other part of this paper is just around the decision-making process as well. And I think there's just a note in the first paragraph about the return to decision sessions and all of that sort of stuff. I don't know if there was anything additional that you wish to add to that.
No, I don't. I think, as all members are aware, there's quite a comprehensive calendar that's evolved since the lockdown. So we are more or less business as usual in terms of decision making. It's the last our last tranche really of our decision making processes is the return to full public scrutiny, as you've already outlined. So we have been delivering executive member decision sessions quite comprehensively for quite a period of time. And most other committees, I think the only committees that we are yet to deliver but are planned is the SACRE meeting and the shareholder committee. And then obviously you've just very eloquently detailed the plans for return to public scrutiny for all of them. So.
Thank you. So I've got a couple of questions, and if there's any more to add, but Councillor Pearson.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks for the paper as well. I'm really appreciate the fact that they're all evening meetings. One question I had was, could you just explain the commissioned meetings, whether that's you, Johnny, or whether that's Dawn that can explain that? My own personal view is that if there's a provisional meeting for a call-in, that it should be a call-in or nothing. That should be what that space is reserved for. I don't like the idea of last-minute meetings going in when there's either a call-in or there isn't. The second point I was going to make was just around Christmas, whether it's sensible to have so many meetings right in the run-up to Christmas and right after Christmas, given everyone's diaries and the importance of Christmas this year to being with family and for everybody, including us councillors. So there you go. There's two questions for you.
Well, I think that there are some suggestions from some ministers that there may not be a Christmas this year, aren't there? But I mean, I think the run into Christmas is always a tricky time. I think certainly in the time that I've been at the council, work doesn't stop. It runs right up till the 23rd. And I appreciate what you're saying, but what we're struggling with is trying to fit as much public scrutiny and as much of council business into a restricted calendar. And so whilst I have some sympathy with what you're saying, I think it is what it is from that perspective. In terms of the commission slots and the call-in, so when we move on to the next agenda item, I'll be able to just explain a little bit more about some of the nuance of that, because there are a couple of things that are in the pipeline. But I think that the way that I'm envisaging that this would work with those meetings is because we have to keep the space clear in the diary for a call-in. I don't want there to be a scramble for a piece of scrutiny, but what I think we can have is pieces of scrutiny work that are not necessarily time dependent or are not as specifically time dependent as something might be for a pre-decision scrutiny work, say for something that was coming up at executive, on the forward plan. And we can lay some of the groundwork that says, right, we are planning to do some scrutiny work, policy development, say, on this particular area. The likelihood is it will be at this meeting. We can start working towards bringing up reports, start working towards getting the groundwork in place. And then we'll be in a position to publish an agenda at very short notice if we know that that's what's happening. If we aren't able to do the meeting because a call-in comes in, we'd then look to one of the other commission slots later in the calendar and say, right, that's when that piece of work is going to happen. And so I think that what would end up happening is it would be no different in a way to all members of CSMC holding that slot available for a call-in, potentially, because you wouldn't necessarily know that a call-in was going to happen with more than a few days' notice. And what we would be doing is talking to the committee members of whichever committee we thought we might be looking to do a piece of work with and saying, please, can you hold this date free? We think that you're going to be doing some commission scrutiny on this date on this topic. We'll be able to confirm with you on this date, because a call-in has to happen within 3 days of a decision having been taken. So if we know what date the executive meeting is, we know what date a call-in has to have been called in by, and so that's the date upon which we can confirm that actually it will be this commission slot. So it's not perfect, but it's trying to work with what we've got, I suppose. Councillor Fenton, did you want to add something? And Dawn, I think you wanted to add something.
I suppose just to be clear for Councillor Pearson, what we're not saying is that if it's a case of there's no call-in, we'll have another CSMC meeting anyway. what's likely, as the chair has set out, is that slot could be used by one of the other scrutiny committees, which, remember, will only be meeting every 3 months. So it's going to be more difficult to time those meetings to, to pick up an issue that needs to be discussed in a particular window ahead of an executive member decision session a couple of weeks hence. So I think it's, yes, I suppose you just want to give you an assurance. It's not a case of, oh, well, we'll have the meeting anyway and we'll find something to talk about. That's not how that's not how it's planned, and it will be. Hopefully we'll make it work. But just to give you that assurance.
Dawn, did you want to just add something as well?
Yeah, it was only just to add a further layer of reassurance, really, which was picking up on the points that Councillor Fenton's just made. We were anticipating, Councillor Pearson, that because of that variable on the commission scrutiny, i.e. we won't necessarily know a significant period of time in advance what that business might be, then we're probably not going to put it on the corporate calendar until such time as we do know, because otherwise we don't want to set public confusion going, basically. We'll keep those dates. We won't use those dates for anything else. We'll keep them informally. But as soon as we know, it's definitely going to be about sky blue thinking, then we'll formally put it in the diary so that we're demonstrating to you, I suppose the point that Councillor Fenton made is they're not just going to be filled willy-nilly, blankly, for nothing specific.
Thanks, Don. Councillor Rowley.
Thanks, Chair. Just a couple of things. So firstly, looking at the calendar of meetings in front of me, all seems fine, and I appreciate the clarification that you've given. In the event that there is a nationally available vaccine which kind of makes the current crisis dissolve, I'm assuming that these meetings, although they're all remote at the moment, the calendar would remain the same, and we'd meet face to face. I guess I'm really keen with the right levels of mitigation. I'm really keen to get back to face-to-face meetings, and I have been for some time, given the fact that we're expecting others to do so outside of the council. So I'd just be keen to see that, to get back to some form of face-to-face meeting. So I was just assuming that if we did get a vaccine and everything went back to normal, these would be fixed dates anyway. My second question really is around the challenge that you gave to the executive around officer support and democracy services support. So we would have full support in terms of resources from democratic services to fulfill these meetings and any work that came from them. So there's two questions in one there, really.
Thanks, Martin. I'll answer the first one, and I'll let Dawn and Janie come in on the second one. My understanding is, and I'm not going to get into the face-to-face or otherwise debate, other than to say that what I think has happened across the council is that we've looked at where the situation is, where we think it might be over the next however long, and concluded that it is more prudent to say, right, we are going to just fix the corporate calendar for the remainder of this municipal year, because actually whatever changes happen, and whether or not it's about face-to-face or otherwise, there's still going to be all sorts of other things in the mix that are limiting factors in terms of being able to deliver scrutiny. One of those limiting factors is around resource that's available, whether that be from dedicated scrutiny officers, whether it be from democratic services more generally, whether it be from the different corporate directorates in terms of what resource they can offer in terms of report writing and all the rest of it. And I suppose some of what I'm alluding to in terms of thinking about the longer term future of scrutiny and around thinking about how we want scrutiny to operate in the years to come, is trying to think about how we can make scrutiny as effective as it possibly can be. And I'm not convinced that what we had pre-coronavirus was especially effective anyway. I think there were already some issues around servicing 6 monthly committees just purely in terms of the resource that was available at that time. And so I'm not suggesting that we pare things down to fit the resource that we have, but what I am suggesting is that we use this next few months to think about what does really good, really effective scrutiny look like in York, and then going forward beyond May, how would we like the calendar to look? What do we need resource-wise to be able to continue to deliver more effective scrutiny? Dawn, did you want to just add anything about resource? And
I just need, sorry about that. I just need to add something about the actual dates, Councillor Rowley, just because obviously the dates we've worked out are based on the meetings being virtual and not on the physical space being available in West offices. So I can't guarantee that if there were any dramatic overhaul, and you know, irrespective of anything any of us might say, that we would get the same dates for some of those meetings, because we might not, because there might not be room space. So that, do you want, just on the resources front, and about how we might support scrutiny moving forward and the commitment to that. Obviously, there's a commitment to supporting scrutiny, undoubtedly. We're still shaping, as every day passes by, how we're going to support scrutiny, given that the vast amount of resources we've currently got in democratic services are needed to support the functioning of virtual meetings. So we're still, you just have to keep bearing with us, is what I would say. We're still working out how we will support the coming months, but we will support it, and we will use what resources are available to us, as the chair says, across the piece throughout the wider council. But what I can't tell you right now is how that's going to look in 6 months' time in terms of what the makeup and the shape of democratic services will look like in terms of supporting scrutiny, because that's a bigger piece of work Jenny and I still need to do.
Councillor Rowley.
Yeah, so I mean, the two things there. Firstly, as far as meetings are concerned, I understand and there's been a lot of hinting in various areas around the council that we may move forward once we are able to meet face to face. There may be some form of hybrid solution that allows those that either can't or don't want to meet face to face for whatever reason to be part of that meeting. And I understand that's an ongoing work that the council and the IT team and everybody else are looking at. I guess in terms of the resources, I just wanted to make sure that, you know, we have a quite an extensive calendar of meetings here, which, you know, I'm prepared to commit to, and that isn't a problem, and a lot of dates that are in there. And it was really just around the fact that, you know, coming back to what was said earlier in the previous agenda item about streamlining, about trying to ensure that you know, where I don't like to use the word cuts, but in a sense that's what it is. You know, where economies are made. What I don't want to do is to commit to such what appears to be an extensive plan of meetings for us then to be stymied by not having the resource that we need in terms of support for democratic services. So it was just a challenge. And Dawn, I appreciate that you don't have a globe in front of you and you can't predict, but that would be my only concern about the meetings, and it's just right for me to raise it. But thank you, Chair.
Thanks for that, Martin. I think what I would just say, just to sort of add to that point in a way, is, you know, we are going to have to think about how we manage our work plans, what areas there might be 10 areas that we'd really like to look at, but actually the reality is that there's only 3 or 4 that we can look at, and actually only a couple of them can be looked at in a public setting with a full kind of what we'd expect to be scrutiny, and there might be different ways of doing things. I think one of the pieces of work that I know you were involved in, and a lot of people were involved in, you know, pre-COVID, was that corporate review of poverty, and you know, that's certainly something that I don't want to lose sight of. But on pieces of work like that, where we previously were able to call on a dedicated scrutiny officer to come and attend meetings and perhaps help with report writing and that sort of stuff, it may be that some of that sort of work has to be more member-led for the time being, with, you know, some guidance and input. But there's nothing to stop some of those groupings meeting with external organisations. In fact, that corporate review of scrutiny could well be even more pertinent than it felt, pre-COVID. And one of the things that I'm hoping will happen with this process is it will be a bit of an evolution, and we will need to be a little bit flexible in how we work, but also thinking about, for example, and I'm totally thinking out loud here really, but I would be quite happy to see members of a committee say, well, this is a piece of work we're interested to go and do some research on and find out about, and come back and do a 20-minute update presentation to this committee to say, well, actually, this is what we've gone and found out about. These are our conclusions and our recommendations, and this committee happy to endorse them, to pass them on to executive, for example. And we'd have to think about, all the whys and wherefores of how that worked, but it wouldn't necessarily be different than the task and finish work that scrutinies have done in the past, but it would just be facilitated in a different way. Councillor Fenton, did you want to just add something?
Yeah, just on a similar theme, I think that, we ultimately will be this committee which will be responsible for taking an overview of the work programmes of all of the scrutiny committees that sit under it. So we've got a job to do in ensuring that those work programmes are realistic and are delivering, are adding value, or actually, contributing towards the overall some of what the council is doing in terms of policy development and that kind of overview function. So we will perhaps need to sort of push back with some committees if we get a list of 20 scrutiny topics that we want to do the next 6 months. Not that anyone would do that. We need to be clear and focused, and make sure that we get best value from from the time and resource that we do have. But I don't see that as being insurmountable.
Thanks, Stephen. I think if everybody's happy, then what I'll suggest we do is, if you're all happy to essentially endorse that as a plan for going forward, and as I say, it is going to be an evolving process to some degree, and I'm very much keen that every committee member, whether it's on this committee or other committees via their chairs, is feeding back information in terms of what is and isn't working, and anything that people are wanting to shift and adapt if needs be. But in a broad sense, that this is the direction of travel I think we're heading in. Councillor Pearson, you've just stuck your hand up. I'll just bring you in quickly.
It was a quick suggestion. I was just going to wonder, just reverting back to my Christmas comment, perhaps we could swap the 18th and the 21st meetings with the 22nd and 23rd. Thus, the two meetings that will definitely happen relatively well before Christmas, and the two meetings that might happen only happen, and they'll be closer to Christmas. It was just a suggestion. Perhaps there's a reason why they've been ordered in that way.
They'll have been ordered in relation to the executive, I would think, but we can certainly take it away and have a look and see. So there's a forum meeting on the 23rd.
Yeah, there's the housing on the 22nd, and there's economy in place forum on the 23rd, and there's the provisional commissioned on the 18th and the provisional CSMC on the 21st. I just wondered if they could be switcherooed, thus giving officers and councillors a bit of a Christmas break if those meetings don't happen.
We can certainly have a look. The reason they'll have been done like that is Chris will have done it on a cyclical pattern, if you know what I mean. So, you get into a pattern of where your public meeting is going to meet roughly and where your forum's going to meet, etc. But I can certainly look at having a swap around. The other thing I was going to say on that earlier, actually, but I didn't want to prolong the debate, was actually every single day, you can guarantee from November onwards, every single day has a virtual committee meeting in it. There is no slack within the calendar at all. So when people start talking about moving dates, now you'll all remember the days when we did 2 or 3 consecutively in one day, but then that was when you had 2 or 3 rooms available to put different members into, etc. And when you didn't need as many staff as you need to operate a virtual meeting. So that's the conundrum we're dealing with. You know, it's the number of staff we need on any one virtual meeting, and the fact that we already have 2 members of the team on secondment, you know, elsewhere. So, and it's a small team, so there's only X numbers to go around, is the point, councillors, I suppose. But we're happy to look at that, Councillor Pearson, see if we can do that swap.
Yeah. All right. Well, what I propose that we do then, as I say, if everybody's just happy to indicate that they're satisfied to kind of give us an endorsement, I suppose, as a scrutiny management point of view, if you just stick us your hand up. Fab. Great. Well, that's where we'll take things, and as I say, it'll evolve as it is, but that gives us a bit of certainty over the next few months. So if I move us then on to agenda item 6, and again, I'm just going to do the same thing. So this is just looking at scrutiny work planning a little bit more specifically, just to emphasise. Well, 2 things actually. One to point out, I did send you all an email earlier today. I'd spotted that the annex to this agenda item is actually the July list that was drawn up. So apologies for the mix-up there. Quite a lot of the things on the list that was annexed to this report have actually already been through the informal committee or through our own committee. And so what I've done is I've sent you an updated list of what I had intended to be annexed to the to this report, but the 2 things actually go in tandem in a way. And what we're planning to do is use this as kind of the basis of a sort of overarching scrutiny work program document, and we haven't got this up and running yet, but what I'm envisaging, because there's obviously quite a lot of work in terms of thinking about how we're managing the way the different committees are operating and how we're selecting and prioritizing pieces of work to do. So what I'd like us to have is a document whereby we can say, well, this suggestion came in via this forum, and we've spoken to the corporate director, and we've spoken to the executive member, and we know that this item's coming up on the executive agenda in January, so therefore it needs to have some pre-decision in November or December time to give us enough time to be able to get that piece of work through. And so we want to be able to map out a bit of a program of some of that work, but also to be able to say to members, well, actually, that piece of work that you've suggested could come for public scrutiny. We don't, unfortunately, have space to be able to do that. These are the reasons why. This is what took priority, and you know, send it back as a kind of, you may wish to take this in a different direction. So again, that's going to be an evolving piece of work, and I'm sort of envisaging it as being a live document. In the 2 pieces that you've had, both the annex that was put forward as part of the meeting pack, and then the list that I've circulated, both of those have been compiled in conjunction with the chairs. The July meeting, the July work plan was then circulated to members of CMT, just in terms of sense checking that there was anything there that was way out of kilter or that was particularly urgent. And I think that this future work plans potentially would also would need to do that in a similar way, because what we are going to need to be clear about, and this again speaks to something a little bit around resources, is, you know, we may need to take decisions that say things like, actually we can take a look at this piece of pre-decision because that report already exists, and therefore it doesn't take an awful lot to get that into scrutiny to be able to have some input, to make some tweaks and some amendments and to make a recommendation, whereas actually this other piece of work over here is a much heftier piece of work. We're not necessarily able to do anything with that at this moment in time, and so then we're making a decision about where it goes forward. And then I suppose what I'm want to do is take any questions on any of that. I don't want to get too much into too much of the minutiae of the detail of what is and isn't on the work plan at the moment, because like I say, it's not necessarily exhaustive. But what I am proposing that we do is we take a couple of steps forward now in terms of thinking about some of those commissioned slots. The reason that I'm thinking that is because we have had some conversations that have happened already, both through this committee and through the scrutiny chairs meetings. And what I'm going to suggest that we do, partly as an example of how this process might work, but also to actually get the ball moving, is make a couple of suggestions for some work that we want to take forward. So the first bit is one of those provisional call-in and commission slots, where the Housing and Community Safety Committee have had some conversation around potentially doing a piece of work around antisocial behaviour within housing, and looking at some of the impact of the suspension of evictions on how you're managing antisocial behaviour in communities and some of that sort of stuff. So we think that there might be a piece of work to do around that. Obviously, we can't commit to that being on that 2nd of November commission slot at the moment, because we don't know whether or not there's going to be a call in. But what we can do is start having the conversations with the relevant officers and the portfolio holders to say that this is a piece of work that we might like to look at if we are in a position to do so. The firmer piece of work is, you'll recall from the call-in, that we had a conversation with Councillor Eyre and made a recommendation that this committee looks at the asset management strategy as a piece of pre-decision work. And myself, Councillor Fenton, Councillor Eyre, Tracy Carter, and I think from memory, Dawn, it was you, wasn't it, that was at that meeting, and we had a meeting to discuss when it might be appropriate to do a piece of pre-decision work, and what could and couldn't be delivered in terms of reporting and what have you. And that item is due to go to the November meeting of executive, which I think from memory is the 26th of November. We have a commission slot on the 23rd of November, which would mean that we could take the report that's due to go to executive with a few tweaks for the pre-decision. We could have the discussion, we could see the recommendations, we could make input or consideration to the recommendations, and we can then make a recommendation to executive based on that meeting. So that's kind of the two different routes, I suppose, that I've outlined in the previous agenda item. But I'd like to suggest that that's how we move this first piece of commissioned work forward. So I'll chuck it over to you for any questions or clarifications or thoughts, but that's where we are. Councillor Fenton.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, just to say, I've briefly discussed with the Vice Chair of Housing and Community Safety how we might want to approach that 2nd of November potential commission scrutiny slot, and we'll be sort of pitching that suggestion to officers and the executive member, and trying to formulate a sort of proposition in terms of what we want to get out of that meeting. And I'm also keen, if we do go ahead with that, to to involve the police, because I'm conscious that in terms of the realms of what we've been up to in the last 6 months, we haven't formally engaged with the police in terms of council scrutiny work. So I think that would be good for us, and hopefully good for them to tell us a bit about what they've been doing and the challenges they're facing. But I'll obviously keep you in the loop as that develops.
Thank you. Councillor Rowley.
Thanks, Chair. So just so on the 2nd, we do a piece of work about scrutiny around a pre-decision. What happens if we then get a call in, and that piece of work that we were going to do pre-decision in terms of scrutiny then can't happen? The executive meeting would happen, so we weren't able then to scrutinise before that. Have I got that right?
No, there's two different things there. So, and apologies if I've not explained it clearly. So, the pre-decision scrutiny that I'm proposing that we do is on the 23rd of November, and that would be this committee to do a pre-decision scrutiny on the report on the asset management strategy, which is due to go to executive 3 or 4 days later. I think we're on the Monday, and that would be on the Thursday, which is tight, but just about enough time for Dem Services to get a report put together, and we'll just have to have an update, I guess, in terms of the report that goes to executive. So that would be pre-decision. On the 2nd of November, what I'm proposing that we do is we commission Housing and Community Safety Scrutiny Committee to hold a public meeting discussing the antisocial behaviour items that we've sort of outlined, and because of the fact that there might be a call in from something to do with executive, which happens on the 20th of October, I think I've got that right, 22nd of October, somewhere around about then. 22nd, thank you. So we'll do the preliminary work now to get things prepared to be able to have a piece of scrutiny work around the antisocial behaviour agenda. Were a call in to come in, we would have to postpone that scrutiny to a later commission slot, because that's not necessarily a time dependent piece of scrutiny work. That's looking at what the impact of antisocial behaviour has been on various communities and how we're managing it and handling it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so in this scenario, it would then go, so it wouldn't go to the 23rd.
No.
Because that's the provisional commission slot where we're going to, but it would potentially bounce to the 1st of December.
Potentially. So we would have to have a conversation. I imagine that what would happen, but you know, we're into new territory here, so we are sort of working it out. But the chairs of scrutiny are meeting on a every other month basis as well. So depending on when that meeting happened, we might discuss it there, or it might just be a case of myself as chair of this committee and Councillor Fenton as chair of housing having a conversation with each other and saying, this call-in has happened, this can't now take place on the 2nd of November. Is there anything else coming up that is urgent or pressing that means it has to move to, say, the December slot or you know, otherwise? Or it might be that it just comes back to this meeting and we say, well, actually, unfortunately, we weren't able to take it on the 2nd of November. It remains a piece of work that we would like to be doing. We're this far down the road in terms of preliminary work, and how are we going to handle it?
Okay, cheers, thank you.
Yep. Okay. Everybody happy and reasonably clear with where we are? So what we're proposing to do from this part of the meeting is develop a scrutiny work program that will be a kind of an all-encompassing, essentially, way of managing the scrutiny work program going forward. And we'll have to think about how all the structures of that work and transparency and making sure that everyone's clear about how we feed into that and all the rest of it. But broadly speaking, we're going to try to manage scrutiny in a what's the right word? Having that overview approach of the whole of scrutiny. So we're going to kind of be doing more of the scrutiny management that this committee is supposed to have been doing, but perhaps hasn't done quite so much of in the past. We're also going to provisionally commission Housing Scrutiny to do this piece of work on antisocial behaviour on the 2nd of November, subject to a call-in, and we're going to commission ourselves as CSMC to do a pre-decision scrutiny work on the asset management strategy on the 23rd of November. Okay, and then what I would just request that everybody does, for those of you that sit on other scrutiny committees, this has all been done in conjunction with other chairs. We've had conversations with all the other chairs. I've asked the other chairs to review their pre-COVID work plans to see if there's anything that's still relevant going forward. And we're trying to manage the work plans and ideas coming out of the forums and what have you. But as I think we've said a couple of times, you know, what's really important is that the more that we can demonstrate a model that gives us some meaningful input, the more I think we'll get out of scrutiny personally and as a council and as an organisation. And so that's what we're trying to do to push it forward. So if everybody's happy with that, yeah, brilliant. So the only other thing that I just wanted to update you on this evening, just before we finish, it's sort of relates to our work plan. It's sort of just an update on a recommendation we made, and it's just regarding the York Central Risk Register, which members will recall from the marathon call-in that we had back in August. We had referred to A&G committee to go to their September meeting, and unfortunately, for various reasons, that didn't happen. So my understanding at the moment is that is due to go to November's meeting. I've been in consultation with both the chair of ANG and with Janie Berry and one or two others about how and why we've reached a situation whereby that didn't go to September's meeting. And I did go to the ANG meeting last week to express my disappointment at what had taken place and the fact that risk register wasn't given the public scrutiny that this committee had requested. It does remain slightly unclear as to whether or not there is a fully up-to-date risk register at the moment, and so we're seeking reassurances at the earliest opportunity. But as I say, it has been suggested that it will come to November's meeting of ANG, but that does somewhat undermine the point of the recommendation that we made from CSMC. So that's just to give you that update. Unless there's any questions on that particular issue, I don't have anything else that I wish to raise. So with a minute to go before 7:30, we're within our 2 hours. I shall call the meeting to a close. Thank you very much, everybody, for your time. It's been another productive meeting. See you all next time.
Thank you.